The
We
evening
faced
light filtered through
hardships
the
I hope
living
you
room
never
window of the
know.
modest two-story
But it
house
was
on
in
Maple
those
Street,
dark
casting
times
long
that we
shadows
found our
across the
true
worn hardwood
strength.
floor.
You see, the
Harold
thing about
Wilson sat in
growing
his
old
favorite
is you
armchair, the one
realize
with
that
patches on the
all
armrest that
those
he'd
little
mended himself,
moments
running
were
his
actually
calloused
the big
fingers over the
ones.
frame of the photograph in his
I
lap.
remember the winter of
Margaret's
48.
smile still had the power to warm
We
his
didn't
heart
have much
15
back
years after
then,
cancer had taken
but
her.
we had each
"Well,
other.
Maggie," he whispered to the empty room, "another Sunday dinner tomorrow." At 68, Harold's once robust frame had begun to show the toll of decades spent on construction sites. His hands, permanently stained with the ghosts of cement and paint, bore the marks of a life dedicated to building things that would last. Homes for families, a future for his son. He'd started as a simple laborer after high school, working his way up to foreman and eventually launching his own modest construction company. It had never made him rich, but it had been enough to raise Ethan after Margaret passed, enough to pay for his college, enough to help with the down payment on that fancy house in Newton, where his son now lived with Diana and the grandkids. Harold placed the photo back on the side table and glanced around the living room. The furniture was outdated, purchased in the early 90s when Margaret was still alive. The television was at least 10 years old. His clothes were serviceable but worn. Not because he couldn't afford better, his pension was modest, but adequate, but because every extra dollar had gone to ensuring Ethan had opportunities he never had. "I never needed bonuses or vacations," Harold said to himself, repeating the mantra that had carried him through the lean years. "My son's smile when he got into college was reward enough for all the calluses on these hands." And those calluses had built more than houses. They'd built a life for Ethan that Harold could only have dreamed of for himself. Harvard Business School, an executive position at a tech company in Boston, a beautiful wife, two healthy grandchildren, a home in one of the most exclusive suburbs. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Margaret's parents, chimed 6 times. Harold rose slowly, his knees protesting after a day spent in the garden. Sunday dinner at Ethan's was at 7. He needed to shower and change into his good clothes, the ones he kept pressed and ready in the closet specifically for these weekly visits. The drive to Newton took 40 minutes. Harold's 15-year-old Ford pickup truck looked conspicuously out of place among the luxury vehicles lining Ethan's neighborhood. He parked at the curb rather than in the driveway, a habit he'd developed after Diana had once mentioned that his old clunker made the property look less prestigious. Ethan's house was impressive, a colonial revival with 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and a landscaped yard that was maintained weekly by professionals. At $1.2 million, it was more house than Ethan and Diana had initially been able to afford, but Harold had co-signed the mortgage and quietly helped with payments during the first 2 years when Ethan's salary hadn't quite caught up with his ambitions. Harold rang the doorbell, holding a small potted plant he'd grown himself. Diana answered, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly at the sight of him. "Harold, you're here," she said, accepting the plant with a polite nod. She was wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Harold's entire wardrobe. "Ethan's in his study finishing up some work emails. Come in." Harold stepped into the foyer, wiping his feet thoroughly on the welcome mat. The house smelled of expensive candles and the pot roast Diana's housekeeper had prepared earlier that day. From the living room, he could hear his grandchildren, Michael and Sarah, playing some kind of video game. "Kids' grandpa's here," Diana called, placing the potted plant on a side table where it would likely be forgotten. Michael, 12, and Sarah, 10, emerged from the living room, eyes still half focused on their devices. "Hi, Grandpa," they said in near unison, accepting his hugs with the dutiful patience of children who had been taught to respect their elders but weren't particularly excited by their company. "I brought you something," Harold said, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing 2 small wooden figures he'd carved himself, a bear for Michael and an owl for Sarah. "Made them in my workshop last week." The children accepted the gifts with polite thanks, but Harold could see they didn't quite know what to make of these simple handmade toys. They were accustomed to electronic gadgets and store-bought items with recognizable brand names. From the kitchen, Harold overheard Diana speaking in hushed tones to someone on the phone. "Yes, he's here now. Brought another one of his plants and some wooden toys for the kids." "I know, right? The musty smell from those old clothes of his takes forever to air out. It really brings down the whole aesthetic of the dining room." Harold pretended not to hear, focusing instead on asking his grandchildren about school. He'd long ago learned that addressing Diana's comments only made things uncomfortable for everyone. Better to maintain the peace to focus on the blessing of being welcome in his son's home at all. Ethan appeared from his study 10 minutes later, dressed in pressed chinos and a button-down shirt that Harold recognized as the brand Diana had once pointedly mentioned cost just under $300. "Dad, good to see you," Ethan said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Sorry, had to wrap up some emails to Tokyo. The market doesn't sleep, you know." "No problem, son," Harold replied, following Ethan to the dining room where Diana was arranging the table with the fine china they use for Sunday dinners. "How's work been treating you?" "Actually fantastic," Ethan said, his face lighting up with the excitement Harold remembered from when he was a boy, showing off a good grade. "Just closed a deal that's going to mean a substantial bonus this quarter. We're thinking about getting a Tesla, the new Model X. Diana's been wanting one for ages." "That's wonderful," Harold said, genuinely happy for his son's success, even as he calculated that a new Tesla would cost more than he'd spent on vehicles in his entire lifetime. "You've always had a head for business. Harvard Business School pays off," Ethan replied with a wink, conveniently omitting that Harold had liquidated his modest investment portfolio to help cover the tuition. Dinner proceeded as it usually did. Diana served the pot roast, which was excellent. Ethan dominated the conversation with stories about work colleagues and the country club, where he was considering taking up membership. The children occasionally chimed in about school or activities. Harold mostly listened, asking questions and offering encouragement. When the conversation turned to their upcoming summer vacation plans, a 2-week trip to Italy, Harold couldn't help but think of all the vacations he and Margaret had postponed. They'd always said they'd travel when Ethan was grown, when the mortgage was paid off, when they'd saved enough. But then Margaret got sick, and all those dreams were filed away in the cabinet of someday that eventually turned into never. "Dad, you're a million miles away," Ethan said, breaking into Harold's thoughts. "Diana was asking if you've given any more thought to her suggestion about the senior living community." Harold blinked, returning to the present. "The one in Brookline, it's very nice, but I'm comfortable in my house. Been there 40 years now." Diana exchanged a glance with Ethan. "It's just that it's so much house for one person, Harold, and the maintenance must be overwhelming at your age." "I manage fine," Harold said mildly. "The garden keeps me active." "But wouldn't it be nice to have people your own age around," Diana pressed, "and medical staff if you need them?" What she didn't say, but what Harold heard clearly, was that they thought he was becoming a burden. That his modest home in the working-class neighborhood where he'd raised Ethan was somehow embarrassing now. That at 68, he should be tucked away somewhere, with other old people out of sight and mind. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing he wouldn't. Later, as they moved to the living room for coffee and the dessert Diana had picked up from the upscale bakery in town, Harold noticed a large envelope on the sideboard addressed to him. It was the paperwork he'd been expecting, the final documents transferring full ownership of his house to Ethan. A month earlier, after one of Diana's more persistent conversations about estate planning and avoiding probate, Harold had agreed to transfer the deed to Ethan. The house, now worth about $450,000, thanks to the booming Massachusetts real estate market, would be Ethan's, with the understanding that Harold would live there for the rest of his life. It had seemed like a sensible decision at the time. The house would eventually go to Ethan anyway. This way there would be no estate taxes, no probate court. But seeing the papers there ready for his signature, Harold felt an unexpected pang of something. Not quite regret, but perhaps a recognition that this was one more piece of himself he was giving away. "The lawyer dropped those by yesterday," Ethan said, following Harold's gaze. "No rush, but when you're ready to sign them, I can get them notarized at the bank." Harold nodded, picking up the envelope. "I'll look them over this week." The evening continued pleasantly enough, though Harold couldn't help noticing how Diana subtly steered Ethan away from any conversations about helping Harold with house repairs or projects. There was always an alternative suggestion, a handyman service, a lawn care company, always with the implication that Harold was becoming too old to manage on his own. When it was time to leave, Ethan walked him to the door, while Diana supervised the children's bedtime preparations. "Thanks for coming, Dad," Ethan set his hand on Harold's shoulder. "Oh, before I forget, we're hosting a dinner party next Saturday. Some colleagues and potential investors I want to impress. Would be great if you could come." "Of course," Harold replied, touched to be included. "Anything I can bring." "Just yourself," Ethan said quickly. "Diana's got a caterer handling everything. 7 o'clock business casual." Harold nodded, knowing business casual meant his one good suit, the one he'd bought for Margaret's funeral and had barely worn since. "I'll be there," he promised, hugging his son goodbye. On the drive home, Harold thought about the transfer papers in the envelope beside him. He'd signed them, of course. What was the house really, but walls and a roof, the memories it contained of Margaret, of raising Ethan? Those would remain his, no matter whose name was on the deed. Still, as he pulled into his driveway and looked at the modest home he'd bought as a young man, with a pregnant wife and dreams bigger than his bank account, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away. The dinner party at Ethan and Diana's house was more elaborate than Harold had anticipated. Valet parking had been arranged for the guests' luxury vehicles, making Harold's decision to park his pickup truck around the corner seem prescient. The house had been transformed with floral arrangements and subtle lighting. Waitstaff in black and white circulated with trays of appetizers and champagne. Harold arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit, dressed in his dark gray suit with a blue tie that Margaret had given him for their 20th anniversary. Diana greeted him at the door, her smile strained. "Harold, you're early," she said, accepting his awkward cheek kiss. She was wearing a black cocktail dress that Harold suspected cost more than his monthly pension. "We're still setting up. Would you mind waiting in the study? Ethan's just finishing up some calls." Harold allowed himself to be ushered to Ethan's home office, understanding that Diana didn't want him wandering around while the final preparations were made. The study was impressively appointed with leather furniture, built-in bookshelves, and a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. On the walls were Ethan's diplomas, professional certifications, and photos of him with various business leaders and minor celebrities. Notably absent were any photos of Harold or of Margaret. Ethan's laptop was open on the desk, the screen showing an email from Vanguard Investments. Harold wasn't intentionally snooping, but the subject line caught his eye. Quarterly statement, joint account number 7729. It was the joint account Harold had opened with Ethan years ago when he'd been helping with the mortgage. Harold had nearly forgotten about it, assuming Ethan had removed his name once the financial assistance was no longer needed. The fact that it still existed and was still joint was interesting. Ethan entered the study, cutting short Harold's thoughts. "Dad, you made it," he said, closing the laptop as he approached. "Thanks for coming. Tonight's really important. We've got the CEO and several board members attending, plus some potential investors from Singapore." "Sounds like a big night," Harold said. "How can I help?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Just be yourself, but maybe keep the construction stories to a minimum. These are sophisticated people and we want them to feel like they're in good company." Harold nodded, understanding perfectly what Ethan was asking. "Don't embarrass us with stories about working with your hands. Don't remind everyone that your son comes from humble beginnings. Be present, but not too present." "I'll let Diana handle the conversation," Harold assured him. The guests began arriving at 7, a parade of expensive suits and designer dresses. Harold was introduced simply as Ethan's father, with no mention of his career or accomplishments. He noticed he was seated at the far end of the table away from Ethan, and the important guest next to an elderly woman who turned out to be the retired mother of one of the board members. The conversation around them flowed freely, fueled by excellent wine and the shared language of wealth and privilege. Harold listened more than he spoke, finding little to contribute to discussions about recent trips to Bali, the challenges of finding good household staff, or the performance of various hedge funds. "It's a constant struggle," said a man Harold had been introduced to as the CFO of Ethan's company. "My parents are in their 70s and refusing to move into assisted living. They insist on staying in that drafty old house in Vermont where I grew up." Several guests nodded sympathetically. "We finally convinced my father to move to Palm Greens," said a woman in a red dress. "He fought it for years, but now he loves it. Plays golf every day, has lady friends for dinner." She laughed, a tinkling sound that somehow managed to be both amused and condescending. "Best decision we ever made for him, even if he didn't know it at the time." "That's the thing about that generation," said another man, gesturing with his wineglass. "They don't always know what's good for them. Sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands." Harold took a sip of water, noting how they discussed their parents as if they were children, incapable of making their own decisions. He wondered if Ethan and Diana had similar conversations about him when he wasn't present. "We're still working on convincing my dad to move to Brookline Estates," Ethan said, glancing down the table at Harold with what might have been apology, but looked more like embarrassment. "It's a process. Well, they can be stubborn, the CFO said. My advice, don't wait too long. The older they get, the harder it is to transition them. Harold felt a chill at the way they discussed transitioning their parents as if they were managing assets rather than human beings with lifetimes of experience and dignity. The dinner itself was exquisite, multiple courses of beautifully presented food that Harold could barely identify, let alone pronounce. He ate carefully, mindful of making any mistakes that might embarrass Ethan. Midway through the main course, as Harold was cutting a piece of what he thought might be duck, his knife slipped, sending a small splash of sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh," he said immediately, dabbing at the spot with his napkin. "I'm sorry about that." Instead of the polite assurance he expected, Harold was met with an awkward silence. Diana's face tightened in obvious irritation while Ethan looked mortified. "Dad?" Ethan said, his voice strained with forced patience. "Why don't you let the staff handle that?" The woman in the red dress tittered behind her hand. "It's just like having children at the table again, isn't it? My father's the same way, can't take him anywhere without a bib." More laughter rippled around the table, and Harold felt his cheeks grow warm. He stopped dabbing at the stain and placed his napkin back in his lap, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement he made. "You know," said the CFO, clearly emboldened by the expensive wine, "this is exactly why elder care facilities exist. No offense, Mr. Wilson, but at a certain point, people just can't take care of themselves properly anymore." "Dad's not there yet," Ethan said quickly, but his tone suggested yet was the operative word. "I manage just fine on my own," Harold said quietly, unable to remain silent any longer. "Been taking care of myself for nearly 70 years now." Diana laughed nervously. "Harold still lives in the house where Ethan grew up. It's quaint. But we're discussing options, aren't we, Harold?" Before Harold could respond, the conversation shifted to the merits of various retirement communities, with his presence at the table seemingly forgotten. He sat silently finishing his meal and declining the offer of more wine. As dessert was being served, something involving chocolate and gold leaf, Harold noticed Ethan becoming increasingly intoxicated. His son's face was flushed, his gestures more expansive, his laughter louder. It was unlike Ethan, who typically maintained careful control, especially in professional settings. "So, Ethan," said one of the Singaporean investors, "tell us about your background. Were you always interested in finance?" Ethan laughed, swirling the scotch in his glass. "God, no, I grew up with nothing. My father," he gestured down the table toward Harold, "was a construction worker. We lived paycheck to paycheck in a little house in Framingham." Harold felt something twist inside him. It wasn't that what Ethan said was untrue exactly. They had indeed lived modestly. But the way he said it, as if it had been some kind of deprivation, as if Harold hadn't worked himself to exhaustion to provide a stable home, felt like a knife between the ribs. "But you put yourself through Harvard Business School, didn't you?" Diana prompted, placing a hand on Ethan's arm. "That's the American dream right there." Ethan nodded, taking another drink. "Full scholarship and student loans," he said, which was a blatant lie. Harold had liquidated his modest retirement account to help pay for that degree, putting his own future security at risk for his son's education. "Worked my way up from nothing." The investors nodded appreciatively, clearly impressed by this narrative of self-made success. Harold stared at his dessert appetite gone. He'd never expected gratitude for the sacrifices he'd made. That wasn't why parents provided for their children. But he'd never expected this revision of history, either this erasure of his contributions. The conversation continued with Ethan painting himself as a bootstrapping success story who had overcome the limitations of his working-class background through sheer grit and intelligence. Each word felt like another small betrayal, another denial of all Harold had given. When the coffee was served, Harold excused himself to use the restroom. In the hallway, he paused, steadying himself against the wall, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. "He's becoming such a liability," he heard Diana's voice from the dining room. "Did you see that mess he made with the sauce?" I know," Ethan replied, his words slightly slurred. "We're working on the Brookline situation. Once the house transfer is complete, we'll have more leverage." "Good," said another voice, the CFO, Harold thought. "These things are never easy, but sometimes you have to be firm. My father resisted too, but in the end, he didn't really have a choice." Harold returned to the bathroom, closing the door quietly behind him. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, the lined face, the gray hair, the tired eyes. When had he become a situation to be managed? When had his son started seeing him not as the man who had raised him, but as a burden to be strategically handled? After composing himself, Harold returned to the dining room just as the conversation had turned to a golfing trip. Several of the men were planning to Pebble Beach. "You play Mr. Wilson?" asked one of the board members, perhaps trying to politely include him. "No," Harold replied simply. "Never had the time or money for golf." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken by Diana quickly changing the subject. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Harold prepared to make his exit as well. He thanked Diana for dinner and was looking for Ethan to say goodbye when he heard raised voices from the kitchen. "I can't believe you mentioned the scholarship thing," Diana was saying, her voice tight with anger. "Your father was sitting right there. What if he'd contradicted you?" "He wouldn't," Ethan replied dismissively. "And anyway, it's not like Chen is going to fact-check my Harvard funding." It made for a better story. "Well, it was risky, and you need to stop drinking so much at these events. You nearly knocked over your water glass. Between you and your father, it's like managing children." Harold stepped back, not wanting to eavesdrop further. He found Ethan's assistant and asked her to tell his son he was leaving, then slipped out the front door without further goodbyes. The night air was cool against his face as he walked to his truck around the corner. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, replaying the events of the evening in his mind. The lies about Harvard, the plans for leverage once the house was transferred, the comparison to a child who couldn't care for himself. Each recollection stung afresh. Harold had always known Ethan had grown different from him, more ambitious, more focused on material success. But until tonight, he hadn't realized how completely Ethan had rewritten their history, erasing Harold's sacrifices in favor of a narrative that cast himself as the sole author of his success. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Harold thought about the transfer papers sitting on his desk, still unsigned. For the first time, he wondered if signing them would be a mistake. The following Sunday, Harold called Ethan to say he wouldn't be able to make dinner due to a touch of the flu. It was a small lie, but he needed time to think, to process what he'd learned at the dinner party. Instead of resting, however, Harold spent the day going through his files, insurance policies, bank statements, property documents, and the paperwork for that joint account he'd glimpsed on Ethan's computer. What he found disturbed him deeply. The joint account, which Harold had opened to help Ethan with house payments during those first lean years, had never been closed. Instead, Ethan had been using it for personal expenses, luxury vacations, Diana's Jewelry Country Club, memberships, all while Harold's name remained on the account, potentially making him liable for any issues that might arise. More concerning was the mortgage paperwork. Harold had co-signed 5 years ago, helping Ethan secure a better interest rate with his excellent credit history. But contrary to what Ethan had told him, Harold had never been removed as a co-borrower. He was still legally responsible for an $875,000 loan on a house where he was increasingly made to feel unwelcome. Then there were the personal loans, $65,000 over 3 years to help with credit card debt, car down payments, and home renovations. Loans that Ethan had promised to repay, but which had gradually been reframed as gifts in their conversations. Harold sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers that told a story very different from the one Ethan had presented to his colleagues. Not the story of a self-made man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, but of a son who had repeatedly relied on his working-class father's financial support while simultaneously distancing himself from that same background. The transfer papers for the house lay untouched on the corner of the table. Harold had been about to sign them last week before the dinner party. Now he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. To his surprise, Ethan stood on the porch, a container of soup in his hands. "Dad," he said, looking genuinely concerned, "Diana said I should check on you. Real flu can be dangerous at your age." Harold felt a flicker of warmth at his son's apparent concern, quickly tempered by the realization that Ethan might be there more about the transfer papers than his well-being. "Thanks, son," he said, stepping back to let Ethan in. "I'm feeling better already. Just needed a quiet day." Ethan's eyes immediately went to the papers spread across the kitchen table. His expression shifted subtly. "Doing some organizing." "Just reviewing my financial situation," Harold said mildly. "At my age, it's good to have everything in order." Ethan nodded, placing the soup on the counter. "Speaking of which, did you get a chance to look over those transfer papers?" "The lawyer's been asking." And there it was, the real reason for the visit. Not concern for Harold's health, but concern for the property transaction. I've been reviewing them, Harold said. Actually, I've been reviewing a lot of paperwork, including our joint account at Vanguard and the mortgage on your house. Ethan's face paled slightly. Oh, any reason in particular? Just making sure everything's as it should be, Harold replied, watching his son carefully. I was surprised to see the joint account is still active and that I'm still on the mortgage. Ethan laughed, but it sounded forced. Just administrative oversight. I meant to take care of that ages ago. You know how it is with paperwork, it's always at the bottom of the to-do list. Seems like an important thing to overlook, Harold observed, especially for a financial executive. The atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted, tension crackling between them like static electricity. Look, Dad, Ethan said, his voice taking on the patient tone he often used when explaining something he deemed beyond Harold's comprehension. It's just been convenient to keep things as they are. But if you're worried, I can take care of it this week. Harold nodded, saying nothing. So about those transfer papers, Ethan prompted again. I'm still thinking about it, Harold said. No rush, right? It's not like I'm planning to go anywhere anytime soon. Something flashed in Ethan's eyes, frustration, perhaps, or calculation. Of course not, but it would be good to get it done for estate planning purposes. I understand, Harold said, though he was beginning to understand far more than Ethan realized. I'll let you know when I've made a decision. Ethan left shortly after the soup container, still sitting untouched on the counter. Harold watched from the window as his son's BMW pulled away the expensive car, a stark contrast to the modest neighborhood where he'd been raised. For the first time, Harold wondered if Ethan's insistence on the house transfer had less to do with estate planning and more to do with securing an asset he already considered his own. The following week passed quietly. Harold begged off Sunday dinner again, citing lingering fatigue from his flu. Instead, he spent the time continuing his financial audit, discovering more disturbing patterns in how Ethan had leveraged their relationship for financial gain, while simultaneously distancing himself socially and emotionally. The next Saturday, however, brought another dinner invitation, this one impossible to decline. Michael's 12th birthday was being celebrated with a family dinner, and Harold's absence would be too conspicuous. The party was smaller than the business dinner, but no less elaborate. Diana had arranged for a professional chef to prepare Michael's favorite foods, and the dining room had been decorated with what appeared to be professionally designed sports-themed decor. Harold brought a gift he'd made himself, a hand-carved chess set with pieces designed to represent Michael's favorite fantasy characters from the books he enjoyed. It had taken Harold months of evening work, each piece crafted with painstaking attention to detail. When Michael opened it, his initial reaction was polite confusion. Thanks, Grandpa, he said, examining one of the pieces. It's really detailed. I can teach you to play, Harold offered. It's a game that requires strategy and thinking ahead. Michael already has chess on his iPad, Dana interjected smoothly. But this is very rustic. We could put it on display in the game room. Harold nodded, trying not to show his disappointment. He'd hoped the gift might create a connection, a reason for Michael to spend time with him, learning the game. Instead, it had been relegated to a decorative curiosity, something to be looked at rather than used. The dinner proceeded with the usual pattern. Ethan dominated the conversation with stories about work. Diana managed the logistics of serving and hosting, and Harold observed from the periphery. The children were more animated than usual, excited by the birthday celebration, but Harold still felt the invisible wall that had seemed to separate him from the family his son had created. After dessert, as Diana was organizing the children for bed, despite their protests, Ethan pulled Harold aside in the study. Dad, he said, closing the door for privacy. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Harold nodded, taking a seat in one of the leather armchairs. What's on your mind, son? The house transfer, Ethan said, getting straight to the point. It's been 2 weeks and you still haven't signed the papers. Is there a problem? Harold considered his words carefully. I've been thinking about it a lot. And about other things, too. The joint account, the mortgage, the loans. Ethan's expression tightened. I told you those are administrative oversights. I'm planning to fix them. Are they, though? Harold asked quietly. Or is it convenient to keep my name on the accounts in the mortgage, to maintain access to my assets while keeping me at arm's length? What are you talking about? Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. I've never taken advantage of you. The $65,000 in loans that were never repaid, Harold said. The joint account you've been using for luxury purchases. The mortgage I'm still legally responsible for on a house where I'm made to feel like an embarrassing guest. Ethan's face flushed. That's not fair. We've always welcomed you here. Have you? Harold asked. At the dinner party, you told your colleagues you paid for Harvard on scholarships and loans. You didn't mention that I liquidated my retirement account to help you. You seated me at the far end of the table away from the important guests. Diana refers to me as Ethan's father rather than by name. You're being overly sensitive, Ethan said dismissively, and bringing up ancient history. So what if I simplified my Harvard story? It makes for better networking. It wasn't just simplified, Harold said. It was a lie that erased my contribution. Just like you've been erasing me from your life while still benefiting from my financial support. The study door opened and Diana looked in, her expression shifting from social smile to concern as she read the tension in the room. Everything okay in here? She asked. Fine, Ethan said tightly. Dad's just having some concerns about the house transfer. Diana's eyes narrowed slightly. What concerns, Harold? It's a straightforward transaction that benefits everyone. You get to stay in the house for life, and Ethan avoids probate later. It's simple estate planning. Harold looked between his son and daughter-in-law, seeing clearly for the first time the united front they presented, not out of malice perhaps, but out of a shared worldview that valued status and financial advantage above emotional bonds. I'm still considering it, Harold said finally. It's a big decision. Diana exchanged a glance with Ethan, something unspoken passing between them. Well, don't consider too long, she said, her tone carefully light. The lawyer charges by the hour for all these consultations. After they returned to the living room, the evening continued with superficial pleasantries, but the undercurrent had changed. Harold could feel Ethan and Diana watching him, evaluating him, perhaps recalculating their approach. When it was time to leave, Ethan walked him to the door. Dad, he said, his voice low, I hope you know everything we're doing is for the best, for all of us. The house transfer makes financial sense. I understand the financial aspects, Harold replied. It's the other aspects I'm not so sure about anymore. Ethan's jaw tightened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm going to take some more time to think, Harold said. Good night, son. The drive home was quiet with only the sound of the pickup's engine and Harold's thoughts for company. He felt a deep sadness settling over him like a heavy blanket, not just for the way Ethan had changed, but for his own blindness to it. How long had he been ignoring the signs, making excuses, pretending that his son's increasing distance was natural rather than calculated? The following week brought another invitation, this time to a Sunday brunch at Ethan and Diana's house. The text message mentioned that a few friends were joining them, but when Harold arrived, he found a much larger gathering than anticipated. At least 20 people milled around the expansive back patio, many of whom Harold recognized from the previous dinner party. Diana greeted him with her usual polite distance, directing him to the buffet table. Help yourself, Harold. Ethan's by the grill if you're looking for him. Harold filled a plate with fruit and pastries, then made his way to where Ethan stood flipping expensive-looking steaks on a professional-grade grill. His son was holding court with several men in golf shirts, all clutching mimosas and laughing at something Ethan had just said. Dad, Ethan said, noticing him. Glad you could make it. Have you met Jim? He's with Brookline Estates, the community we were telling you about. Harold shook hands with a smooth-looking man in his 40s who smiled with practiced warmth. Mr. Wilson, pleasure to meet you. Ethan's told me all about your situation. My situation, Harold repeated, glancing at his son. Your living arrangement, Jim clarified, not picking up on the tension. We have a beautiful unit available right now in our senior complex. Independent living, but with all the amenities and care options you might need as you progress. Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. I see. And Ethan's been discussing this with you. Oh yes, Jim said enthusiastically. We've been over the floor plans, the financial arrangements, everything. Just waiting on you to come for a tour. In fact, we could go tomorrow if you're free. Harold looked at Ethan, who at least had the grace to appear uncomfortable. I thought it would be good for you to have options, Dad, especially with the house transfer coming up. The house transfer that I haven't agreed to yet, Harold said quietly. An awkward silence fell over the small group. Jim, sensing the tension, excused himself to check on those mimosas. "Dad," Ethan said once they were alone, his voice low and intense, "you're being unreasonable. The house transfer is a smart financial move, and Brookline Estates is perfect for someone in your position." "And what position is that?" Harold asked. "You're getting older," Ethan said as if explaining something to a child. "The house is too much for you to maintain. You need to be around people who can help if something happens." "I'm 68, not 98, Harold replied, "and I've maintained that house for 40 years without issue." Ethan's expression hardened. "This isn't up for debate. The papers are ready. Jim's holding the unit for you, and Diana's already spoken with a real estate agent about listing the house once it's transferred." Harold stared at his son, genuinely shocked by the presumption. "You're planning to sell my house, the one I've lived in for 40 years, the one where your mother died?" "It makes financial sense," Ethan insisted. "The market's hot right now, and that neighborhood is finally gentrifying. We could get top dollar and use the proceeds to secure your spot at Brookline." "No," Harold said, the word falling between them like a stone. "I'm not signing the transfer. I'm not moving to Brookline Estates, and I'm not selling my home." Ethan's face flushed with anger. "Don't be stubborn, Dad. This isn't just about you. It's about what's best for the family." "The family," Harold repeated, "or what's best for you and Diana?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan demanded. Before Harold could respond, Diana appeared at Ethan's side, her smile fixed in place but her eyes calculating. "Everything okay here? The Chens are asking about your investment strategy, Ethan." "Fine," Ethan said tersely. "Dad and I were just discussing his living situation." "Oh, good," Diana said, turning her attention to Harold. "Did Ethan tell you we've already reserved the deposit on the Brookline unit? It's really lovely, Harold. Much more appropriate for someone at your stage of life." Harold looked between them, seeing clearly the united front they presented. Not malicious, perhaps, but determined to arrange his life according to their convenience and financial benefit, with little regard for his wishes or dignity. "I should go," Harold said quietly. "Dad, don't be like that," Ethan said, his tone a mixture of exasperation and condescension. "We're just trying to help." "I'm not sure that's what this is," Harold replied. He set his barely touched plate on a nearby table. "Thank you for brunch. I'll see myself out." As Harold walked through the house toward the front door, he overheard Diana speaking to one of her friends. "Elderly parents can be so difficult. They just don't understand what's best for them." The drive home was a blur, Harold's thoughts racing as he processed what he'd just learned. Ethan and Diana weren't simply suggesting a senior community. They had already made arrangements, paid deposits, and planned to sell his house out from under him once the transfer was complete. It was a betrayal so complete that Harold couldn't quite grasp it all at once. The son he'd sacrificed everything for had been systematically planning to divest him of his autonomy, his home, and his dignity, all while maintaining the narrative that it was for his own good. When Harold arrived home, he sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the modest house he'd built a life in, the house where Margaret had died, the house where he'd raised Ethan from a colicky baby to a promising young man, the house that apparently his son now viewed as nothing more than an asset to be liquidated for financial gain. Inside, Harold moved through the familiar rooms, seeing them now through new eyes. The worn furniture that Diana found embarrassing. The family photos that documented a shared history Ethan seemed eager to revise. The workshop in the basement where he'd spent countless hours creating things with his hands. Toys for Ethan as a boy, furniture for their home, and most recently the chess set that would likely gather dust in some forgotten corner of his son's mansion. In his study, Harold sat at the desk and pulled out the house transfer papers he still hadn't signed. He read them carefully now, noting the clauses that would give Ethan full control of the property while allowing Harold to remain as essentially a tenant. There was nothing explicitly stating that Harold couldn't be moved elsewhere if Ethan deemed it necessary. Next, he reviewed the joint account statements, the mortgage paperwork, the loan documents, all the financial threads that still connected him to his son's life, even as the emotional bonds had frayed almost to breaking. As the evening shadows lengthened across the room, Harold came to a decision. Not out of anger or a desire for revenge, but out of a clear-eyed recognition that the relationship he thought he had with his son no longer existed and perhaps never had, at least not in recent years. He would need to speak with a lawyer, his bank, maybe a financial advisor. He would need to sever the financial entanglements that Ethan had maintained while simultaneously pushing Harold to the periphery of his life. It wouldn't be about punishment. It would be about reclaiming his dignity, his autonomy, and whatever years he had left. The following Sunday, Harold didn't call to cancel dinner. He simply didn't show up. When Ethan texted, then called, Harold let the messages go to voicemail. He needed time to think, to plan, to decide on the right course of action. Monday morning, Harold made an appointment with an attorney, not the family lawyer who had drawn up the transfer papers, but a new one recommended by a former colleague. He needed independent advice from someone with no connection to Ethan or his interests. As he drove to the appointment, Harold thought about the dinner party again, about the moment that had clarified everything. Not just Ethan's lies about Harvard or Diana's thinly veiled contempt, but the plans they'd been making without his knowledge or consent. The assumption that his life, his home, his future were all ultimately under their control. And for the first time, Harold allowed himself to acknowledge the full extent of what had been happening. His son had been systematically using him for financial benefit while simultaneously pushing him out of his life. It was a bitter realization, but also a clarifying one. And with clarity, Harold knew exactly what he needed to do next. Harold couldn't sleep that night. The conversation with the attorney, Mr. Peterson, kept replaying in his mind. The older lawyer had listened carefully to Harold's situation, his bushy white eyebrows furrowing as Harold explained about the joint accounts, the co-signed mortgage, and the house transfer papers he'd nearly signed. "So you're telling me," Peterson had said, leaning forward in his leather chair, "that your son has maintained these financial connections while simultaneously planning to move you into assisted living and sell your home?" Harold had nodded, the truth of it still painful to acknowledge aloud. "And you co-signed his mortgage, loaned him substantial sums that were never repaid, and he's now presenting a narrative that erases your contributions entirely." "That's correct," Harold had replied. Peterson had removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully with a handkerchief. "Mr. Wilson, I've been practicing elder law for 40 years. What you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Children who view their parents as financial resources rather than people deserving of respect and autonomy." Now staring at the darkened ceiling of his bedroom, Harold considered Peterson's advice. The attorney had outlined several options, all perfectly legal, all within Harold's rights. But taking those steps would irrevocably change his relationship with Ethan. It would make explicit what had been implicit in recent years, that the bond between them had fundamentally changed. Harold rose early the next morning, made coffee, and sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. He began listing every financial connection between himself and Ethan: the joint account, the mortgage co-signature, the outstanding loans, the house deed. For each item, he wrote down the action he needed to take. His phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Dad, we missed you at dinner yesterday. Everything okay?" Harold set the phone aside without responding. For once, he needed to think about his own interests rather than immediately addressing his son's concerns. By noon, he had a clear plan of action. It wasn't about revenge or punishing Ethan. It was about reclaiming his autonomy and protecting himself from decisions others were trying to make for him. He would meet with the bank, update his will, and consult with the real estate agent, all before speaking with Ethan again. As Harold was preparing to leave for his first appointment, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Diana standing on his porch, her expression a careful mask of concern. "Harold," she said, "we've been worried. You didn't show up for dinner, and you're not answering Ethan's calls." "I needed some time to think," Harold replied, not inviting her in. Diana's eyes darted past him to the interior of the house. "Think about what is this about the Brookline Estates situation, because we're really trying to do what's best for you." "Are you?" Harold asked mildly. Something flashed in Diana's eyes, irritation perhaps, or calculation. "Of course we are. You're getting older, Harold. The house is too much for you, and frankly, we are concerned about your decision-making lately." "My decision-making," Harold repeated. "Yes," Diana said, her tone becoming more confident. "Ethan mentioned you've been reviewing financial documents, asking questions about accounts that have been set up for years. It's concerning behavior." Harold almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Reviewing his own financial information was now being framed as a sign of diminished capacity. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but I'm perfectly capable of managing my affairs." "Well, that's debatable," Diana replied, her mask of concern slipping slightly. Ethan thinks it might be time for a more thorough evaluation of your situation, medically speaking. And there it was, the implied threat that if Harold didn't comply with their plans, they might seek to have him declared incompetent. The realization sent a chill through him. "I have an appointment," he said, reaching for his coat. "We can discuss this another time." Diana's eyes narrowed. "The house transfer papers, Harold. They need to be signed this week." The lawyer's getting impatient. "I'm still reviewing them," Harold said, locking his door. "There's nothing to review," Diana said, her voice rising slightly. "It's a standard arrangement. You stay in the house, Ethan gets the deed. Simple." "And then what?" Harold asked, turning to face her fully. "Then I get moved to Brookline Estates and the house gets sold." Diana's momentary silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Harold said. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He walked past her to his truck, feeling her eyes boring into his back. As he pulled away, he saw her in the rearview mirror, already on her phone, undoubtedly calling Ethan. The bank was Harold's first stop. The manager, Mr. Chen, was a man in his 50s who had known Harold for years. "Mr. Wilson," he said, ushering Harold into his office. "What can I do for you today?" Harold explained about the joint account with Ethan, how it had been established to help with the mortgage, but had since been used for other purposes. "I'd like to remove my name from the account," he said. "Or if that's not possible, freeze it and open a new account solely in my name." Chen nodded, typing on his computer. "I can see the account here. It's a joint account with equal access and withdrawal rights. You're within your rights to withdraw your portion and close your connection to it." "And what about liability?" Harold asked. "If there are debts or overdrafts associated with the account." "As a joint holder, you're jointly responsible," Chen confirmed. "Which is why separating yourself is a prudent move if you're concerned." "I am," Harold said simply. Chen walked him through the process of withdrawing his funds, approximately $47,000, his share of the balance, and transferring them to a new account solely in his name. He also helped Harold update the contact information and security protocols on all his accounts, ensuring that Ethan no longer had access. "There's one more thing," Harold said. "The mortgage on my son's house. I'm a co-signer, but I'd like to review the terms and understand my options." Chen pulled up the mortgage information. "It's a substantial loan, $875,000, with a current balance of approximately $780,000. As co-signer, you're equally responsible for the payments." "And if I wanted to remove myself as co-signer," Chen's expression turned grave. "That's more complicated. The lender approved the mortgage based partly on your credit history and income. Removing you would essentially require refinancing the loan, which would need your son's cooperation and potentially a higher interest rate for him." Harold nodded, making a note in his book. This would be a conversation for Peterson, his lawyer. Next, Harold visited a real estate agent recommended by Peterson, a woman named Gloria Martinez, who specialized in properties in Harold's neighborhood. "The market's hot right now," she confirmed, reviewing comparable sales in the area. "Your home with its sheet-and-a-half-acre lot would likely list around $520,000 to $540,000 in the current market." "And if I wanted to sell quickly," Harold asked, "we could price it aggressively at $495,000 and likely have multiple offers within days," Martinez said. "But may I ask why the rush waiting for spring could potentially net you an additional 5 to 10%? Harold explained his situation in broad terms, his need to make decisions about his property before others made them for him. "I see," Martinez said, her expression softening with understanding. "In that case, I'd recommend we start the process immediately. I can have a photographer out tomorrow, listing live by Friday." Harold thanked her and signed the listing agreement, specifying that the information was to be kept confidential until the listing went public. He didn't want Ethan or Diana finding out prematurely. By late afternoon, Harold had accomplished everything on his list for the day. He'd separated his finances from Ethan's, initiated the home selling process, and scheduled another meeting with Peterson to discuss the mortgage situation. He felt a weight lifting, not the burden of the decisions themselves, but the clarity that came with taking action. His phone had buzzed throughout the day, with messages from Ethan growing increasingly urgent and irritated. Finally, as Harold pulled into his driveway, it rang again. This time he answered. "Dad," Ethan said without preamble, "what the hell is going on? Diana said you were acting strange, and now the bank tells me there's an issue with our joint account." "I've been making some changes to my financial arrangements," Harold said calmly. Without discussing them with me, Ethan demanded. That account has been set up for years. Why mess with it now? It seemed time, Harold replied. I'm organizing my affairs. What does that mean? And why aren't you answering my texts? We had dinner planned yesterday. I needed some time to think, Harold said, about the house transfer, about Brookline Estates, about a lot of things. Ethan's sigh of frustration was audible. Dad, we've been over this. The house transfer is simple estate planning, and Brookline is a fantastic facility, much better than you rattling around alone in that old house. My old house that you've already made plans to sell, Harold said. A telling pause. Who told you that? Diana mentioned your conversations with a real estate agent, Harold said, about listing the house once the transfer was complete. That was theoretical, Ethan backpedaled. Long-term planning. It didn't sound theoretical, Harold countered. It sounded quite advanced. Look, Ethan said, his tone shifting to one of forced patience. Why don't we discuss this over dinner tomorrow night? Just you, me, and Diana. We can clear the air. Harold considered declining, but perhaps it was better to have this conversation directly. All right, what time? 7, Ethan said, sounding relieved. And Dad, bring those transfer papers. Let's get this settled once and for all. After hanging up, Harold sat in his truck for a long moment. Tomorrow's dinner would be difficult, but necessary. It would be the first time he'd confront Ethan directly about what he'd discovered, about the plans being made, without his input about the systematic financial entanglement that benefited Ethan while undermining Harold's autonomy. But first, there was one more thing he needed to do. Harold drove to a locksmith in town and arranged to have all the locks on his house changed the following morning. If things went poorly at dinner, he wanted to ensure his home remained secure. The next evening, Harold arrived at Ethan and Diana's house precisely at 7, dressed in his good suit, but without the house transfer papers. The atmosphere was tense from the moment he walked in, with Diana's smile not reaching her eyes, and Ethan watching him with barely concealed impatience. Dad, Ethan said after cursory greetings, where are the transfer papers? I didn't bring them, Harold replied, taking a seat in the living room. I've decided not to sign them. Ethan and Diana exchanged glances. That's not really an option at this point, Diana said, her voice tight. We've already made arrangements based on the transfer proceeding. Arrangements I wasn't consulted about, Harold pointed out. Because they're for your benefit, Ethan said, pouring himself a scotch without offering one to Harold. You're being stubborn about this, and frankly, it's concerning. What's concerning, Harold countered, is discovering that my son and daughter-in-law have been making plans to sell my home and move me into a facility without my knowledge or consent. It's not like that, Ethan protested, though his eyes slid away from Harold's direct gaze. It's exactly like that, Harold said. You've arranged a unit at Brookline Estates, spoken with real estate agents about listing my house, and tried to pressure me into signing away my property rights, all while maintaining financial entanglements that benefit you and potentially put me at risk. Diana's facade cracked slightly. This is ridiculous. We're trying to help you, Harold. The house is too big for you, too much maintenance. Brookline has activities, medical care, people your own age. I don't want or need those things, Harold said firmly. I'm comfortable in my home. This isn't just about what you want, Ethan said, his voice rising. It's about what makes sense for everyone. The house is a valuable asset that's just sitting there depreciating while you rattle around in it alone. And there it was, the truth behind all the concern and planning. The house wasn't seen as Harold's home of 40 years, the place where he'd raised his family and built his life. It was an asset that wasn't being properly leveraged for financial gain. The house is mine, Harold said quietly. Not yours, not Diana's, not an asset to be liquidated, mine. Ethan drained his scotch and poured another larger one. Actually, that's debatable. I've been paying the property taxes for the past 3 years. I've paid for repairs, maintenance, a new roof. I have a substantial financial interest in that property. Which I never asked for, Harold pointed out, and which pales in comparison to what I've given you over the years. Here we go, Diana muttered, rolling her eyes. The martyr routine. Harold turned to her. It's not martyrdom to acknowledge reality, Diana. I liquidated my retirement account to pay for Ethan's Harvard education. I co-signed his mortgage when his income wasn't sufficient. I've loaned him over $65,000 that was never repaid. That was all voluntary, Ethan said dismissively. Nobody forced you. Just as nobody is forcing you to make decisions about my home and my life, Harold replied. Yet here we are. The tension in the room was palpable. Diana stood and walked to the bar cart, pouring herself a glass of wine. This is getting us nowhere, Strom. Harold, the fact remains that you're getting older. The house is too much for you. Brookline Estates is the sensible solution. I'm not going to Brookline, Harold said firmly, and I'm not signing the house transfer. Ethan's face flushed with anger. You're being irrational. This is exactly why we're concerned about your decision-making. My decision-making is fine, Harold said. I've simply decided not to do what you want. What I want at the street, Ethan said, his voice rising, is for my father to be taken care of properly instead of living like a hermit in a decaying house in a neighborhood that's barely safe anymore. The neighborhood is fine, Harold said, and so am I. You're not fine, Ethan shouted, slamming his glass down. You're old dad. You're getting forgetful, you're becoming paranoid, and you're making bad decisions. That's why we need to step in. Harold felt a cold clarity settling over him. This wasn't about his welfare. This was about control, about Ethan's impatience with a father who wasn't complying with his plans. I've made an appointment for you, Diana interjected smoothly, with Dr. Michaels next week for an evaluation. What kind of evaluation? Harold asked, though he already knew. A cognitive assessment, Diana said, to determine if you're still capable of making major financial decisions independently. Harold stared at them, these people he barely recognized anymore. You're trying to have me declared incompetent because I won't sign over my house to you. That's an unfair characterization, Ethan protested but weakly. Is it? Harold asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been systematically positioning yourself to take control of my assets while pushing me to the margins of your life. That's absurd, Diana said sharply. We've included you in family dinners every week. We invited you to Michael's birthday party. We're trying to help you. You've included me as an obligation, Harold corrected. Seated me at the far end of the table at parties, introduced me as Ethan's father, rather than by name, made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that I'm an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. Ethan's face darkened with anger. This is the thanks we get for looking out for you, for planning for your future, for making sure you're taken care of. I never asked for that kind of care, Harold replied. What I ask for, what any parent asks for, is basic respect and consideration. Respect, Ethan repeated, his voice dripping with derision. You want respect for what exactly? For working a blue-collar job your whole life, for never advancing beyond foreman, for living in the same modest house for 40 years while the rest of the world passed you by. Each word landed like a blow, revealing the contempt that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. I want respect, Harold said quietly, for raising you alone after your mother died, for working 60-hour weeks so you could have opportunities I never had, for sacrificing my own comfort and retirement security so you could attend an Ivy League school and become the success you are today. Oh, please, Diana interjected. Everyone's parents make sacrifices. It's called being a parent. You don't get a medal for doing what you're supposed to do. Harold looked at her, then back at Ethan, who had drained his third scotch and was now pacing the living room like a caged animal. You're right, Diana, Harold conceded. Parents don't deserve special recognition for doing their job. But they do deserve basic dignity in their old age and the right to make their own choices about how and where they live. Not if those choices are bad ones, Ethan snapped. And who decides what's bad, Harold asked. You, because it seems like any choice that doesn't align with your financial interests is automatically deemed bad or a sign of diminished capacity. Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face Harold, his expression twisted with anger. You know what? This conversation is pointless. You've clearly made up your mind to be difficult. I've made up my mind to maintain my independence, Harold corrected. Independence, Ethan scoffed. Is that what you call it? Living alone in that outdated house, wearing the same clothes for decades, driving that embarrassing truck. Yes, Harold said simply. That's exactly what I call it. Making my own choices based on my own values rather than what others think I should want or have. Your values, Diana said with a dismissive wave, are from another era. Things change, Harold. People evolve, except you apparently. Harold studied them both, his son flushed with alcohol and anger, his daughter-in-law cold and calculating. These were not people who had his best interests at heart. These were people who saw him as an obstacle to their plans, a problem to be managed. "I think I should go," Harold said, rising from his seat. "Sit down, Dad," Ethan ordered. "We haven't resolved anything yet." "I've resolved what I needed to," Harold replied. "I won't be signing the transfer papers. I won't be moving to Brookline Estates. And I won't be attending any evaluation with Dr. Michaels." "You don't have a choice," Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice low and threatening. "If you won't cooperate, we'll have to take more formal steps." "Are you threatening to have me declared incompetent because I won't give you my house?" Harold asked, wanting to hear him say it directly. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm saying that your behavior lately suggests diminished capacity, and as your son, I have a responsibility to ensure you're protected even from yourself." Harold felt a profound sadness washing over him. This man, this stranger wearing his son's face, was prepared to strip him of his legal rights in order to gain control of his property. What had happened to the boy he had raised, the child who had once looked at him with love and admiration? "I'm leaving now," Harold said, moving toward the door. Ethan blocked his path. "The transfer papers, Dad. This would all be so much simpler if you just signed them." "No," Harold said firmly. What happened next occurred so quickly that Harold barely had time to register it. Ethan's face contorted with rage. He leaned forward across the short distance between them and spat directly into Harold's face. The room fell into shocked silence. A drop of spittle slid down Harold's cheek toward his collar. Diana gasped softly, but not in horror. There was a note of surprised amusement in the sound. "You're old," Ethan said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're weak, you're worthless, and you're standing in my way." Harold slowly, deliberately removed his handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. He said nothing, but something in his eyes must have registered with Ethan, who took a half-step backward. "Dad," Ethan began, perhaps realizing he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Don't," Harold said quietly, pocketing the handkerchief. "Don't say another word." He moved past Ethan toward the door. Diana remained frozen by the bar cart, her wineglass halfway to her lips. "This isn't over," Ethan called after him, his voice a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear. "You can't just walk away from this." But Harold could and did. He walked out the front door, closed it behind him, and made his way to his truck. His hands were steady as he inserted the key into the ignition. His breathing was calm. To an observer, he might have appeared unaffected by what had just transpired. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. The moment Ethan's spittle had landed on his face, Harold had crossed a threshold. The man who had driven to Ethan's house that evening, the father still hoping for reconciliation, still making excuses for his son's behavior, that man was gone. In his place was someone colder, clearer, more resolute. As he drove home, Harold realized that what he felt wasn't anger. It was a kind of clarity, painful but necessary. His son, the boy he had raised and sacrificed for, was gone. The man who had taken his place viewed Harold not as a father to be loved and respected, but as an obstacle to be removed, an asset to be acquired, a problem to be managed. The realization didn't break him. It hardened him. When Harold arrived home, he didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he sat in his truck staring at the modest house he'd owned for 4 decades. The house where he'd brought Margaret as a bride, where they'd raised Ethan, where he'd mourned her passing. It wasn't just walls and a roof, it was the physical embodiment of his life's work and memories. And his son wanted to sell it out from under him, to convert it from a home into Kishanj. Harold finally went inside, his movements deliberate and calm. In the kitchen, he washed his face thoroughly, scrubbing away any lingering trace of Ethan's saliva. Then he made himself a cup of tea and sat at the table thinking. What had happened tonight wasn't just an argument or a momentary loss of temper. It was the revelation of how Ethan truly saw him as someone old, weak, and worthless. Someone whose dignity could be violated without consequence. Someone whose property and autonomy were up for grabs. Harold sipped his tea and considered his options. The steps he'd taken earlier, separating his finances, arranging to sell the house, those had been preventative measures. Now, after tonight, they seemed like necessary acts of self-preservation. He picked up his phone and saw a series of texts from Ethan, alternating between angry accusations and half-hearted apologies. "You left before we could resolve anything. I shouldn't have lost my temper, but you're being unreasonable. This could all be so simple if you just cooperate. I'm sorry about what happened, but you pushed me too far. Harold deleted them all without responding. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he called Peterson his lawyer despite the late hour. Something's happened, he said when Peterson answered. I need to accelerate everything we discussed. Are you all right? Peterson asked, concern evident in his voice. I'm fine, Harold said, but I need to move quickly now. Can you come to my house tomorrow morning? There are papers I need to sign. Peterson agreed and Harold hung up. Next, he called Gloria Martinez, the real estate agent. I want to list the house immediately, he said. Not next week, tomorrow. That's unusually fast, Martinez said cautiously. Is everything okay, Mr. Wilson? Everything's fine, Harold assured her. But circumstances have changed, and I need to move quickly. Martinez agreed to send a photographer first thing in the morning and have the listing live by afternoon. Harold thanked her and hung up. Finally, he called the locksmith who had changed his locks that morning and arranged for additional security measures, a deadbolt for the back door window locks, and motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house. With those calls made, Harold felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. The path forward was clear now. Sell the house. Sever all financial ties with Ethan. Start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without the painful associations that now clouded every corner of his life here. It wasn't revenge he wanted. It was freedom from expectations, from manipulation, from the constant erosion of his dignity. Freedom to live his remaining years on his own terms without being treated as a burden or a resource to be exploited. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Harold was already awake, having slept little. He made coffee and began systematically sorting through his belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. It was a task he'd been postponing for years, but now it felt urgent and necessary. Peterson arrived at 9 carrying his briefcase and wearing an expression of professional concern. You sounded upset last night, he said after Harold had ushered him into the kitchen and offered him coffee. What happened? Harold recounted the previous evening's confrontation, including Ethan's shocking act of spitting in his face. Peterson's expression darkened as he listened. That crosses a line, the lawyer said when Harold had finished. From financial manipulation to outright elder abuse. I wouldn't go that far. Harold demurred, uncomfortable with the term despite what had happened. I would, Peterson said firmly. And a court likely would too, but let's focus on protecting you and your assets, which is why I'm here. He opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Based on our previous conversation, I've prepared everything we discussed. Revocation of the power of attorney. Ethan currently holds removal of his name from your medical directives and an injunction preventing him from seeking guardianship without due process and independent medical evaluation. Harold reviewed and signed each document, feeling a weight lifting with each signature. These weren't acts of anger or retribution. They were necessary steps to protect himself from a son who had demonstrated he couldn't be trusted with Harold's welfare. What about the mortgage? Harold asked. I'm still a co-signer. Peterson nodded grimly. That's more complicated. You can't unilaterally remove yourself without Ethan's cooperation. However, you can notify the lender that you'll no longer be making payments or accepting responsibility for the loan. It won't legally remove your liability, but it establishes a paper trail of your intent. In the joint account, I've already withdrawn my share of the funds, but it's still open. I'll send a formal letter today and instructing the bank to freeze the account and prevent any further transactions without dual authorization. Peterson said, it's not perfect, but it provides some protection. By the time Peterson left, Harold had signed over a dozen documents, each one another step toward disentangling himself from Ethan's financial web. It was both liberating and deeply sad, the legal dissolution of a relationship that had already broken on an emotional level. The real estate photographer arrived shortly after capturing images of the house Harold had maintained so carefully over the decades. Martinez followed, bringing paperwork for the listing and discussing strategy. Given the market and your desire for a quick sale, I recommend listing at $495,000, she advised. It's slightly below market value, but it should generate immediate interest and potentially multiple offers. Harold agreed, signing the listing agreement and additional disclosures. The house would officially go on the market the following morning. As Martinez was leaving, a car pulled into the driveway, Ethan's BMW. Harold thanked Martinez for her help and saw her out the front door, nodding politely as she passed Ethan on the walkway. Dad, Ethan said, his expression a carefully arranged mask of contrition. We need to talk about last night. I don't think there's anything to discuss, Harold replied, not inviting him in. Ethan noticed the locksmith's van parked across the street where the technician was gathering tools for the additional security installations. His eyes narrowed. You changed the locks. Yes, Harold said simply. That's ridiculous, Ethan sputtered. I have a key to this house. I've always had a key. Not anymore, Harold said. Who was that woman leaving just now? Ethan demanded, changing tactics. The one with the portfolio case. A business associate, Harold said. Ethan's expression darkened. What are you up to, Dad? If this is some kind of retaliation for last night. It's not retaliation, Harold interrupted. It's self-preservation. Self-preservation, Ethan repeated incredulously. From what your own family, the people trying to help you. From the man who spat in my face when I refused to sign over my house to him, Harold said quietly. Ethan had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, but it quickly passed. I lost my temper. It was wrong and I'm sorry, but you're still not thinking clearly about your situation. My situation is that I'm a competent adult making decisions about my own property and life, Harold said. Decisions you don't get to make for me. Ethan's jaw tightened. We'll see about that. Diana's already spoken with Dr. Michaels. The evaluation is scheduled for next week. I won't be attending, Harold said calmly. You don't have a choice, Ethan insisted. If necessary, we'll petition for temporary guardianship on the grounds that you're making irrational financial decisions that put yourself at risk. Harold regarded his son sadly. Is that really who you've become, Ethan? Someone who would have his own father declared incompetent to gain control of his assets. It's not about the assets, Ethan protested, though his eyes slid away from Harold's direct gaze. It's about ensuring you're properly cared for. No, Harold said firmly. It's about the house and the money and your convenience. It's always been about that. Ethan's face flushed with anger. You're being paranoid and irrational, which only proves my point about your declining capacity. I'm being clear-eyed, Harold corrected, perhaps for the first time in years when it comes to you. They stood facing each other across the threshold, father and son connected by blood, but separated by a chasm of values and perception that seemed unbridgeable. This isn't over, Ethan said, finally turning to leave. You can change your locks, but you can't shut me out of decisions about your welfare. I have rights as your next of kin. And I have rights as a competent adult, Harold replied. Rights I intend to exercise. He watched as Ethan stalked back to his car and drove away, tires squealing slightly on the pavement, a small but telling display of childish anger from a man who prided himself on sophistication and control. Inside, Harold resumed his sorting now with greater urgency. He had no doubt that Ethan would follow through on his threat to seek guardianship. Peterson had warned him about this possibility, which was why they had filed the preemptive injunction requiring independent medical evaluation before any guardianship hearing could proceed. It was a legal chess game now, and Harold needed to stay several moves ahead. The house needed to be sold quickly, the proceeds secured, and his new living arrangements established before Ethan could maneuver to block him. By late afternoon, the locksmith had completed the additional security installations, and Harold's house was now as secure as a modest suburban home could reasonably be. Martinez called to confirm that the listing would go live the next morning, with the first showing scheduled for the following day. Harold's phone had buzzed periodically throughout the day, with messages from Ethan alternating between conciliatory and threatening. We need to talk this through calmly. Don't do anything you'll regret. Diana's worried about your mental state. If you force our hand on this guardianship issue, it won't go well for you. Harold ignored them all. Instead, he focused on practical matters, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions, deciding what was truly important to keep. Margaret's photos and letters, the wooden box containing Ethan's baby shoes and first drawings from a time before everything changed. The tools he'd used throughout his working life, many of which had been gifts from colleagues or special purchases to mark professional milestones. It was a bittersweet process, this distillation of a life into what could fit in a few boxes and suitcases. But it was also clarifying. Without the weight of the accumulated physical objects, Harold could see more clearly what truly mattered at his memories, his dignity, his right to self-determination. That evening, as Harold was preparing a simple dinner, his phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Wilson, this is Dr. Michaels. Ethan asked me to call you directly about scheduling your evaluation. Harold's grip on the phone tightened. Dr. Michaels, I appreciate the call, but I have not consented to any evaluation, nor do I require one. There was a pause on the other end. I understand your reluctance, the doctor said carefully. However, your son has expressed significant concerns about recent changes in your behavior and decision-making. As a geriatric specialist, I can tell you that sometimes the people closest to us notice changes before we do. With all due respect, Harold replied, my son's concerns are primarily motivated by financial interests, not genuine concern for my welfare. That's a serious allegation, Dr. Michaels said, sounding taken aback. It's also accurate, Harold said. My son and daughter-in-law have been planning to move me into assisted living and sell my home without my knowledge or consent. When I refused to cooperate, my son became physically threatening. There was another longer pause. Mr. Wilson, if there's been any kind of elder abuse, that's a matter for... I'm handling it, Harold interrupted. And part of handling it is declining this evaluation, which I believe has been arranged as a pretext for seeking guardianship over me and my assets. I see, Dr. Michaels said, sounding increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Wilson, I had no idea the situation was so complex. Perhaps it would be best if I spoke with both you and your son together in my office to better understand what's happening here. That won't be necessary, Harold said firmly. I've already consulted with my attorney and taken steps to protect myself legally. If you have further questions about my cognitive capacity, they should be directed to Mr. Peterson at Davis Peterson and Associates. After ending the call, Harold felt a grim satisfaction. Ethan had clearly expected the doctor to be an ally in his guardianship strategy. Instead, Harold's direct and articulate refusal had likely raised questions in Dr. Michaels' mind about Ethan's motives. The evening passed quietly. Harold continued his sorting and packing, preparing for a future that now seemed both uncertain and urgently necessary. He had no specific destination in mind, yet only the certainty that he needed to leave this place and start fresh somewhere without the painful associations that now colored every corner of his life here. As he was preparing for bed, Harold's phone rang again. This time it was Martinez, the real estate agent, calling with unexpected news. Mr. Wilson, I know this is unusual, but one of our premier clients saw the preliminary photos of your home today before the listing even went live and wants to make an offer immediately. Harold sat down surprised. Already the listing isn't even active yet. I know, Martinez said, sounding excited. It's unusual, but it happens with distinctive properties. This client is an investor who buys properties in neighborhoods he believes are up and coming. He's offering $10,000 all cash with a 7-day closing period. Harold was momentarily speechless. The offer was $15,000 above the planned listing price, and the rapid closing period was exactly what he needed given Ethan's threats. There's one more thing, Martinez added. He's willing to let you rent back the house for up to 60 days after closing while you arrange your next living situation. Standard rate would be about $2,500 per month. It was almost too perfect a quick sale at above asking price with the flexibility to stay temporarily while he finalized his plans. Harold asked Martinez to send over the offer documents immediately, which she promised to do. After hanging up, Harold sat at his kitchen table feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the house would sell quickly and cleanly, sadness at the impending loss of the home he'd loved for so long, and a quiet, steely determination to see this process through to free himself from Ethan's manipulations and start anew on his own terms. The following morning, Peterson arrived early to review the purchase offer with Harold. It's a solid offer, the lawyer confirmed after examining the documents. The buyer appears legitimate, the terms are favorable, and the quick closing works in your favor given the circumstances. Harold signed the acceptance documents, feeling both a weight lifting and a new heaviness settling in his chest. This house had been his anchor for 40 years. Selling it was necessary, but not without emotional cost. What about the proceeds? Harold asked. I'm concerned about keeping them secure given Ethan's threats. Peterson nodded, understanding. I've arranged for the funds to be transferred directly to a new account at Boston Trust Bank, one that Ethan has no knowledge of or access to. Once the sale closes, we can discuss longer-term strategies for protecting your assets. As Peterson was leaving, he paused at the door. Harold, have you thought about where you'll go after the sale? Ethan knows this address, and if he's serious about pursuing guardianship, he'll need to locate you to serve papers. Harold nodded. I'm working on it. I have some ideas. In truth, he had been thinking about it constantly. He needed somewhere far enough away that Ethan couldn't easily find him, but comfortable enough for him to start a new chapter. Somewhere without painful associations, where he could be anonymous and peaceful. After Peterson left, Harold sat at his computer researching options. He had always been drawn to the coast, to the rhythm of the tides and the expansive horizon. Margaret had loved the ocean too. They had always talked about retiring to a small coastal town, maybe in New England or down in the Carolinas. Perhaps it was time to fulfill that old dream, even if he would be doing it alone. Harold was deep in his research when his phone rang. It was Martinez again, sounding apologetic. Mr. Wilson, I'm calling because there's been a situation. Ethan Wilson just showed up at our office demanding to know if you've listed your house for sale. He was quite agitated. Harold's stomach tightened. What did you tell him? Nothing specific, Martinez assured him. Client confidentiality is something we take very seriously, but he was insistent. He claimed to have power of attorney for you and demanded to see any contracts you might have signed. He doesn't have power of attorney, Harold said firmly. I revoked it yesterday. That's what I suspected, Martinez said. That's why I refused to provide any information. But he threatened to return with documentation and legal representation. I wanted to warn you. Harold thanked her for the call and her discretion. After hanging up, he sat motionless for several minutes considering the implications. Ethan was moving faster and more aggressively than anticipated. The guardianship threat wasn't idle talk. He was actively trying to gain control of Harold's affairs. This realization spurred Harold to action. He needed to accelerate his own plans. The house sale was proceeding, but he needed to secure his personal items and important documents immediately in case Ethan attempted something more direct. Harold spent the afternoon gathering essential papers, photographs, and irreplaceable mementos. He packed them carefully into 2 large suitcases, which he then loaded into his truck. He wasn't leaving yet, but he wanted to be ready to go at a moment's notice if necessary. As evening approached, Harold was in his workshop, carefully wrapping his most cherished tools in old towels for protection, when he heard a car pull into his driveway. Looking out the window, he saw not Ethan's BMW, but a police cruiser. 2 officers approached his front door and rang the bell. Harold met them there, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Mr. Harold Wilson, one of the officers asked. Yes, that's me. Sir, we're here on a welfare check. Your son contacted the department with concerns about your mental health and decision-making capacity. He believes you may be a danger to yourself. Harold felt a cold anger spreading through him. This was Ethan's new tactic, using the police to gain access and potentially support for his guardianship claim. I'm perfectly fine, as you can see, Harold said calmly. My son and I are having a disagreement about my living arrangements and financial decisions. He wants a control of my house and assets. I prefer to maintain my independence. The officers exchanged glances. Sir, we're required to follow up on these calls. Would you mind if we came in briefly to confirm that everything is in order? Not at all, Harold said, stepping back to admit them. I have nothing to hide. The officers conducted a cursory inspection of the house, noting the orderliness and maintenance. They asked Harold a series of standard questions about his orientation to time and place, his medications, his daily routines. Harold answered everything clearly and coherently. Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Wilson, the lead officer said finally. I apologize for the intrusion. No apology necessary, Harold assured them. You're doing your job. But I would like to document this visit and your findings if that's possible. My son has threatened to seek guardianship over me, and I'm concerned he'll use false claims of incapacity as justification. The officers looked uncomfortable, but agreed to provide Harold with a business card and incident number for the call. It wasn't a formal declaration of his competence, but it was another piece of evidence for Peterson to use if needed. After the police left, Harold called Peterson to update him on this latest development. The lawyer was concerned but not surprised. It's a common tactic, Peterson explained, using welfare checks to create a paper trail suggesting instability or risk. But it sounds like you handled it well. The officer's report should actually help our case, not hurt it. What's next? Harold asked. What else should I be prepared for? Peterson sighed heavily. If he's escalating to involving the police, he's likely to move forward with the guardianship petition soon. Have you thought more about where you'll go after the sale? Yes, Harold said. I've been researching coastal towns in the North Carolina, quiet places where I might start fresh. Good. Peterson approved. Once the sale closes and funds are secured, I'd recommend moving quickly. Change your phone number, use a P.O. box for mail, and be selective about who knows your new address. It's not about hiding permanently, it's about giving yourself breathing room until the legal issues are resolved. After hanging up, Harold returned to his packing with renewed urgency. The confrontation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated, with Ethan using increasingly aggressive tactics. The house sale couldn't close quickly enough. That night, as Harold lay in bed, he found his thoughts drifting to Margaret. What would she think of what was happening, of what their son had become, of the drastic steps Harold was now taking? I tried, Maggie, he whispered to the darkness. I tried to be patient, to make excuses for him, to preserve the relationship, but I can't let him take my dignity along with everything else. The silence held no answers, but Harold felt a sense of peace nonetheless. He was doing what was necessary to protect himself, not out of anger or a desire for revenge, but out of self-respect and the simple human right to determine his own path. The following day brought another development. The buyer of Harold's house had completed their inspection ahead of schedule and was satisfied with the condition of the property. The closing date was confirmed for exactly 1 week later. Martinez called with the news, sounding relieved. Everything's proceeding smoothly, Mr. Wilson. The buyer is highly motivated and has all financing in place. Barring any unforeseen complications, you'll have the funds in your account next Thursday. Harold thanked her for the update, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. 1 week from now, he would no longer own the house he'd lived in for most of his adult life. The house where he'd raised Ethan, where he'd cared for Margaret in her final days, where he'd built a modest but dignified life with his own 2 hands. But the house was just walls and a roof. The memories would remain his regardless of whose name was on the deed. And his dignity, the thing Ethan had tried to strip from him with calculated manipulation, and that shocking act of public humiliation, that was something no one could take unless he surrendered it willingly. And Harold Wilson had no intention of surrendering anything ever again. The morning of the closing arrived under a pale gray sky, the kind that seemed to hover between seasons. Harold rose early, dressed carefully in his good suit, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking around the room that had been the heart of his home for 40 years. The house felt different now, partially packed with spaces where familiar objects had been for decades. The family photos had been carefully wrapped and placed in a box, along with Margaret's china and the hand-carved wooden bowl that had held fruit on the counter since 1987. The rooms echoed slightly, the emptying spaces creating an acoustic hollowness that mirrored the emotional transition Harold was experiencing. This wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was the end of a chapter of his life, a severance not just from the physical structure, but from the illusion he'd maintained about his relationship with his son. Peterson had arranged for the closing to occur at his office rather than the standard title company, offering Harold additional privacy and security given the circumstances. They had not informed Ethan of the sale, nor were they legally required to. The deed was solely in Harold's name, and he had full authority to sell without consultation or approval from his son. Still, Harold was prepared for potential complications. Ethan had made several increasingly frantic attempts to contact him over the past week, calls, texts, even a certified letter demanding Harold cease any erratic financial decisions pending a medical evaluation. The letter had gone unanswered, the calls unreturned. Harold had nothing left to say to the man who had spat in his face. At precisely 9 o'clock, Harold locked his front door and walked to his truck. The morning was quiet, the neighborhood still, with most residents already gone to work. He took a final look at the house, the porch where he'd taught Ethan to tie his shoes, the oak tree they'd planted together when Margaret died, the workshop window where he'd spent countless hours creating things with his hands. Then he started the engine and drove away, not allowing himself to look back again. Peterson's office was in a renovated Victorian on the edge of downtown, its dark wood and beveled glass speaking of tradition and stability. Harold was shown immediately to the conference room where the buyer's attorney, the closing agent, and Martinez were already waiting. Mr. Wilson, Martinez greeted him warmly. Everything is in order, Mr. Takahashi couldn't be here personally, but his attorney has full authorization to proceed. The buyer's attorney, a precise woman in her 50s named Eleanor Grant, nodded professionally. My client is very pleased with the property and appreciates the expedited timeline. The funds have been wired to the escrow account and are ready for disbursement upon completion of the paperwork. The closing proceeded smoothly, a methodical procession of signatures and notarizations. Harold signed each document with careful deliberation, watching as page by page his ownership of the house transferred to someone else. There was a strange relief in it, a weight lifting, even as a new heaviness settled in his chest. "Congratulations, Mr. Wilson," the closing agent said when the final document was signed. "The sale is complete. The funds will be transferred to your new account at Boston Trust by end of business today." Peterson, who had been observing quietly from the corner, stepped forward. "I've arranged for immediate confirmation of the transfer. We should receive notification within the hour." Harold thanked everyone, shook hands with Grant, and followed Peterson back to his private office. Only when the door closed behind them did he allow himself to exhale fully, the tension of the past week momentarily released. "It's done," he said simply. Peterson nodded, pouring 2 cups of coffee from a carafe on his credenza. "It is, and just in time from what I understand. My office received a call yesterday from an attorney named James Brennan inquiring about your legal representation and hinting at an upcoming guardianship petition." Harold accepted the coffee with a grimace. "Ethan's moving quickly." "Quickly but not wisely," Peterson observed. "A guardianship petition requires substantial evidence of incapacity which he doesn't have. The police report from the welfare check actually works in your favor. It documents you as oriented, organized, and articulate." "Still, I'd prefer to be gone before any papers can be served," Harold said. "Have you heard anything from the bank?" Peterson checked his email, then nodded with satisfaction. "Just came through. The funds, 507,450, after closing costs, have been successfully transferred to your new account. The rental back agreement has also been executed, giving you 60 days of occupancy at $1,200 per month, which has already been deducted from the proceeds." "Good," Harold said, feeling another increment of tension release. The money was secure beyond Ethan's reach, and he had 2 months to finalize his relocation plans if needed, though he intended to move much sooner. "What's your next step?" Peterson asked. Harold sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I'll be leaving town for a while. I've made arrangements for a short-term rental in Cape May, New Jersey, while I explore more permanent options along the coast." "Cape May is a good choice," Peterson approved. "Far enough away to provide separation, but not so remote that you'll lack necessary services. When do you plan to depart?" "Tomorrow morning," Harold said. "I've packed what matters most. The rest can be shipped once I have a permanent address or donated if I decide to start fresh." Peterson made a note in his file. "And your contact information, I'll need a way to reach you regarding any legal developments." Harold provided his new cell phone number. He'd changed carriers the day before, and the address of the property management company handling his rental in Cape May. "I'll be staying in one of their cottages near the beach. They've agreed to hold any mail or deliveries for me." "Excellent," Peterson said, closing his file. "Just one more thing. This arrived for you yesterday." He handed Harold a thick envelope. "It's the updated will you requested removing Ethan as both beneficiary and executor. As discussed, your estate will now be divided between your grandchildren when they reach age 25, with a small provision for the veterans organization you mentioned." Harold accepted the envelope, feeling a profound sadness. Removing Ethan from his will felt like the final acknowledgement that their relationship was irreparably broken. Not because Harold was vindictive, but because trust had been so fundamentally violated that it couldn't be restored. "I'll review and sign it before I leave town," he promised, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. As Harold prepared to depart, Peterson offered one final piece of advice. "Harold, I know you're hurt and disappointed, and rightfully so, but don't let this situation consume you. You've taken the necessary steps to protect yourself. Now focus on building a new chapter that brings you peace." Harold nodded, grateful for the counsel. "That's the plan. Not revenge, just release." Outside, the gray sky had begun to clear, patches of blue appearing between the clouds. Harold drove not to his former house. He couldn't think of it as home anymore, but to the small, extended-stay hotel where he'd reserved a room for the night. He'd moved his essential belongings there the previous day, not wanting to spend his final night in the house that now belonged to someone else. The hotel was unremarkable but clean, the room anonymous in the way of all such temporary accommodations. Harold hung his suit carefully in the closet and changed into more comfortable clothes. He had one more task to complete before he could truly begin his journey forward. From his briefcase, Harold removed a manila envelope containing several documents. The first was a letter to the mortgage company, formally notifying them that he would no longer be making payments or accepting responsibility for Ethan's home loan. It wouldn't legally remove his liability, but it established his intent to separate himself from the obligation. The second was a letter to Ethan's employer retracting the statements Ethan had made to colleagues about receiving scholarships for Harvard. It was direct but not vindictive, simply stating that Harold had liquidated his retirement account to pay for Ethan's education, contrary to Ethan's public claims. Harold had debated sending this letter concerned it might appear petty or vengeful. But ultimately, he decided that truth mattered. Not to punish Ethan, but to correct a false narrative that had erased Harold's sacrifices. The third document was the most difficult, a brief letter to Michael and Sarah, his grandchildren. Harold had agonized over what to say, how to explain his disappearance from their lives, without burdening them with adult conflicts they couldn't be expected to understand. In the end, he kept it simple. Dear Michael and Sarah, by the time you read this, I will have moved away. This isn't because I don't love you, I do very much. It's because sometimes adults need to make difficult choices to maintain their dignity and independence. I want you to know that I will always be your grandfather, even from a distance. I've arranged for you each to receive a gift on your birthdays and at Christmas. As you grow older, you may have questions about my absence. When that time comes, I hope we can reconnect and I can explain more fully. Remember that woodworking I taught you last summer, Michael and Sarah, the birdhouse we painted together? Those skills and memories are part of you now, just as you will always be part of my heart. With love, Grandpa Harold. He sealed each letter in its envelope, addressing them carefully. The first two would be mailed tomorrow from Cape May, adding distance and time before they reached their recipients. The letter to his grandchildren he would entrust to Peterson, with instructions to deliver it only if Ethan and Diana made false statements about his departure or mental state. With these final communications prepared, Harold felt a sense of completion. He hadn't lashed out in anger or sought to inflict pain in return for what he'd experienced. He'd simply taken the necessary steps to protect himself and establish truth where falsehoods had taken root. His phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Opening it cautiously, he found a message from Diana. Harold, this has gone far enough. Ethan is consulting with the attorneys about emergency guardianship. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Call us immediately so we can resolve this situation. Harold deleted the message without responding. There was nothing left to discuss, no resolution to be found in further conversation. Ethan and Diana had shown their true priorities with unmistakable clarity. Now Harold was showing his dignity over subordination, truth over manipulation, peace over conflict. He spent the evening methodically checking his preparations for tomorrow's departure. The maps were marked with his route to Cape May, avoiding major highways where possible to reduce the likelihood of Ethan attempting to intercept him. His important documents were organized in a leather portfolio: birth certificate, social security card, medical records, banking information. The new will from Peterson was reviewed, signed, and would be returned to the lawyer's office via courier in the morning. As Harold completed these practical tasks, he felt a strange calm settling over him. Not happiness. The pain of Ethan's betrayal was still too raw for that, but a kind of acceptance. The situation was what it was. He couldn't change his son's choices or character. He could only decide how he himself would respond, what kind of life he would build from the pieces left to him. Before retiring, Harold checked the weather for tomorrow's drive: clear and mild, perfect traveling conditions. Cape May was approximately 7 hours away, a distance that offered safety without isolation. He'd start early before dawn to maximize the distance he could put between himself and the life he was leaving behind. Sleep came easier than Harold had expected. Deep and dreamless, his body surrendering to exhaustion after weeks of tension and difficult decisions. When his alarm sounded at 4:30 a.m., he rose immediately, his mind clear and focused on the day ahead. The hotel was quiet at that early hour. The hallways empty, the lobby staffed by a single half-awake attendant who barely looked up as Harold checked out. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, the streets empty. Harold loaded his few bags into the truck and began the drive east toward the coast, toward a future he hadn't planned but now embraced with quiet determination. As the miles accumulated behind him, Harold felt the weight of the past few weeks gradually lightening. The road ahead was literal and metaphorical, stretching toward horizons both geographic and personal. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, his decisions were guided solely by his own needs and preferences, not by obligations to others or attempts to maintain relationships that had become increasingly one-sided. It was a bittersweet freedom, born of painful separation, but freedom nonetheless. Harold stopped only twice during the drive, once for fuel, once for a quick lunch at a roadside diner. He kept his phone turned off, not wanting to be distracted by messages from Ethan or Diana that might attempt to delay or derail his journey. They would eventually discover he was gone, of course. The rental back agreement would tell them the house had been sold, if nothing else. But by then, Harold would be established in his new location, his assets secured, his legal protections in place. Cape May welcomed him with golden afternoon light, illuminating its Victorian architecture and tree-lined streets. The property management office was easy to find, a small building near the beach with a weathered sign and friendly staff. The manager, a woman named Barbara with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense manner, handed over the keys to his rental cottage with minimal paperwork. "It's the blue one at the end of Seaview Lane," she explained, marking a map for him. 2 bedrooms, fully furnished, private path to the beach. The off-season rate includes utilities and basic cable. Anything else you need, just call the office. "Thank you," Harold said, appreciating her efficiency. "Is there a secure way to receive mail or packages here?" "Anything delivered to our office address with your name and cottage number will be held safely," Barbara assured him. "We're staffed year-round, even in winter." The cottage was exactly as described, modest but comfortable, with simple furniture and large windows that welcomed the late afternoon light. The ocean was visible from the small deck, a constant presence just beyond the dunes. Harold stood for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of the waves, feeling the salt air on his face. Margaret would have loved this place, he thought. They had always talked about retiring near the ocean. He unpacked methodically, arranging his few possessions in the unfamiliar space. Clothes in the bedroom dresser, important documents in the desk drawer. Margaret's photo on the bedside table where he could see her face first thing each morning. When everything was in its place, Harold walked down the private path to the beach. It was nearly deserted at this hour in season, just a few locals walking dogs or collecting shells along the water's edge. He removed his shoes and let his feet sink into the cool sand, the tactile sensation grounding him in the present moment. The vastness of the ocean stretched before him, endless and unchanging, yet constantly in motion. It struck Harold as an apt metaphor for this phase of his life, a fundamental stability beneath the surface turmoil, a permanence that transcended temporary disruptions. He walked until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the beach and painting the water with streaks of gold and crimson. Only then did he return to the cottage, muscles pleasantly tired from the day's journey and the long walk. He prepared a simple dinner from groceries Barbara had thoughtfully stocked in the refrigerator, then settled on the deck with a cup of tea, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. In that quiet moment, Harold allowed himself to fully acknowledge what had happened and what he had done in response. He had left behind the house where he'd lived most of his adult life. He had severed financial and legal ties with his only son. He had started over at 68 in age, when most people were settling into familiar routines and established relationships. It wasn't what he had imagined for his later years, but then he hadn't imagined his son would become someone capable of such calculated disrespect and manipulation. He hadn't imagined being treated as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The night air grew chilly, and Harold moved inside, closing the door on the darkness. Tomorrow would bring practical matters, setting up local bank access, finding a doctor, exploring his new temporary home. But tonight was for reflection, for acknowledging the ending of one chapter and the tentative beginning of another. Harold turned on his phone for the first time since leaving the hotel that morning. As expected, there were multiple missed calls and messages from both Ethan and Diana, their tone evolving from irritation to concern to barely veiled threats. The final message, received just 2 hours ago, was the most revealing. "Dad, the property management company says you've sold the house. What the hell are you thinking? That house is my inheritance, my children's legacy. You had no right to sell it without consulting me. I'm meeting with attorneys tomorrow. This isn't over." Harold read the message twice, noting the revealing focus on the property rather than Harold's welfare or whereabouts. Not, where are you? Are you safe? But how dare you sell what I considered mine? It confirmed yet again that he had made the right decision, painful though it was. He deleted all the messages without responding, then sent a brief email to Peterson updating him on his safe arrival in Cape May. There was nothing more to be said to Ethan. No explanation or justification that would bridge the fundamental disconnect in their values and perspectives. The following week established a new routine for Harold. Mornings began with coffee on the deck, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic. Then a walk on the beach, gradually extending his range as he explored the shoreline in both directions. Afternoons were for practical matters. He opened an account at the local bank branch, registered with a medical practice recommended by Barbara, and found a small workshop space he could rent by the month to continue his woodworking. The town embraced him with the casual friendliness of a place accustomed to newcomers. Harold introduced himself simply as Harold, recently retired from Massachusetts, offering no further details about his circumstances. People respected his privacy while welcoming him to community events and local gatherings. At the workshop, Harold began a new project, a chess set similar to the one he'd made for Michael, but with pieces inspired by the sea. It was therapeutic, this transformation of raw wood into something ordered and beautiful. The familiar movements of his hands with tools provided continuity amidst so much change. Peterson called on the 10th day, his tone carefully neutral. Ethan has officially filed for guardianship, he reported. As expected, he's claiming cognitive decline and financial vulnerability. However, his petition is fundamentally flawed. He doesn't know your current address, so he can't properly serve you with papers. And we've already filed our counter documentation, including the police welfare check report and statements from your doctor and banker, attesting to your competence. What happens next? Harold asked, unsurprised, but still saddened by this confirmation of Ethan's intentions. The court has scheduled a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks, Peterson explained. I'll represent you, so you don't need to appear personally. Given the documentation we've provided, I expect the petition to be dismissed at this stage. Ethan's attorney should have advised him against filing without stronger evidence. And if it's not dismissed, then we proceed to a full hearing where we present our substantial evidence of your competence and independence. But Harold, I don't anticipate that being necessary. This petition appears motivated by anger rather than legitimate concern, and the courts are increasingly sensitive to potential financial exploitation of elders by family members. After the call, Harold sat on the deck processing this latest development. Ethan's action wasn't surprising, but it still hurt to have confirmation that his son would go to such lengths to control him. Not out of love or concern, but out of entitlement and anger at losing access to assets he had come to view as rightfully his. That evening, walking along the shore as the tide came in, Harold found himself thinking not of Ethan, but of Michael and Sarah. His grandchildren were innocent in this conflict, yet they would inevitably be affected by his absence. They would hear Ethan and Diana's version of events, perhaps come to view their grandfather as the villain in the story. This realization led Harold to a decision. When he returned to the cottage, he sat at the small desk and wrote 2 letters, one to Michael, one to Sarah. In each, he enclosed a check for $5,000 to be held in trust for their education, along with a simple note. This gift comes with no strings attached, only love. When you're older, if you ever want to know my side of the story, I will be here. He included Peterson's contact information, then sealed and addressed the envelopes. Peterson had agreed to act as an intermediary, ensuring the gifts reached the children without giving Ethan their grandfather's location. The following morning, Harold mailed the letters at the local post office, then continued his exploration of Cape May. He discovered a small coffee shop near the beach that made excellent blueberry muffins, a bookstore with a surprisingly robust woodworking section, and a community center that offered classes in everything from watercolor painting to ballroom dancing. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it had potential. There was a simplicity to his days now, an absence of the tension that had increasingly characterized his interactions with Ethan and Diana. Here he was, just Harold, not a financial resource to be managed, not an inconvenience to be handled, just a man building a quiet life on his own terms. 3 weeks passed each day, bringing small discoveries and incremental healing. Harold's workshop project progressed, the chess pieces taking form beneath his careful hands. He joined a weekly gathering of retirees at the community center where conversations ranged from local politics to fishing tips to recommendations for the best chowder in town. No one asked probing questions about his past, accepting him as he presented himself a newcomer looking for community and purpose in his retirement years. Peterson called on the day of the preliminary hearing, his voice conveying satisfaction before he even delivered the news. "The petition has been dismissed," he reported. The judge was quite direct in her assessment, stating that the documentation presented failed to establish any legitimate concerns about your capacity. She also noted the troubling timing of the petition coming immediately after you exercised your legal right to sell property that was solely in your name. "How did Ethan react?" Harold asked. Not sure why he still cared. Peterson paused before answering. "Not well. He became quite agitated in court, which only reinforced the judge's impression that the petition was motivated by financial interests rather than genuine concern. His attorney had to physically restrain him at one point." Harold closed his eyes, imagining the scene, Ethan accustomed to control and deference confronted with a system that saw through his manipulations and denied him what he wanted. "Will he appeal?" "He can try," Peterson said, "but it would be ill-advised. His attorney should counsel against it." The judge's dismissal was quite thorough in addressing the lack of evidence for incapacity. Any appeal would likely fail and potentially result in sanctions for frivolous litigation. After thanking Peterson for his representation, Harold walked to the beach, needing the open space and rhythmic waves to process this latest development. The legal threat had been hanging over him since he'd arrived in Cape May, a shadow on his attempt to build something new. Its dismissal should have brought relief, but what Harold felt was closer to grief, a final confirmation that his relationship with his son was beyond repair. As he walked along the shore, Harold realized he had been harboring a small, irrational hope that once the immediate anger passed, Ethan might reflect on his actions and recognize the harm he had caused. That he might reach out not to demand or threaten, but to understand and perhaps eventually reconcile. The guardianship petition and Ethan's reaction to its dismissal extinguished that hope. This wasn't a temporary breach that time might heal. It was a fundamental revelation of character and values that couldn't be undone or overlooked. The sun was setting as Harold made his way back to the cottage, casting long shadows across the sand. Inside, he made a simple dinner, then sat at the desk with a notepad making lists and calculations. His 2-month rental would be ending soon. It was time to decide return to Massachusetts and the conflict waiting there, or make a more permanent move to this coastal community that had begun to feel like a potential home. The financial aspects were straightforward. The proceeds from the house sale, combined with his pension and modest investments, provided sufficient resources for him to live comfortably in Cape May or similar communities. Housing costs would be his largest expense, but even there he had options: continuing to rent, purchasing a small condo, perhaps even buying another modest house if he chose to put down more permanent roots. The emotional calculus was more complex. Staying meant accepting the distance from his grandchildren, potentially for years or forever. It meant building a new support network from scratch at an age when many people were relying on long-established relationships. It meant, in some sense, conceding that Ethan had driven him away from his home and community. Yet returning seemed equally problematic. The legal threat might be temporarily neutralized, but the underlying conflict remained. Ethan had demonstrated his willingness to use any means necessary to control Harold's decisions and access his assets. Proximity would only make further confrontations more likely. Harold closed his notebook without making a final decision. There was no rush. The rental could be extended month to month if needed. Cape May in autumn was beautiful, the summer crowds gone, the beaches peaceful. He could take time to ensure his next decision was made from clarity rather than reaction. The following day brought another development, a letter forwarded through Peterson's office. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Diana's. Harold opened it with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Inside was a single page, the message brief and pointed. "Harold, your disappearing act has created significant problems for this family." The guardianship petition was humiliating for Ethan professionally and personally. His colleagues now question his judgment, and several important clients have distanced themselves. More importantly, your absence is affecting Michael and Sarah. They don't understand why their grandfather suddenly vanished. We've told them you needed special care that we couldn't provide, but this explanation won't suffice indefinitely. If you care about your grandchildren at all, you'll contact us and work toward a reasonable solution. Ethan is willing to forget the house sale if you agree to regular medical evaluations and financial oversight, reasonable requests that you inexplicably rejected. This situation reflects poorly on all of us. It's time to act like the responsible adult you claim to be. Diana Harold read the letter twice, noting what it revealed about Diana's priorities. Not concern for his welfare or recognition of the events that had precipitated his departure, but concern for appearances, professional consequences, and the inconvenience his absence had caused. Even the mention of the grandchildren felt manipulative, a lever being pulled rather than a genuine worry about their emotional well-being. And the solution offered was telling Ethan would forgive Harold for exercising his legal right to sell his own property if Harold would submit to the very control he had left to escape. It wasn't an olive branch, it was another attempt at manipulation cloaked in concern for the grandchildren. Harold placed the letter in his desk drawer without responding. Diana's message only confirmed that nothing fundamental had changed. The same dynamics that had driven him away remained in place, perhaps even intensified by Ethan's legal defeat and its consequences. As for Michael and Sarah, the story Diana and Ethan had told them was both cruel and calculated, presenting Harold's absence as the result of incapacity rather than a response to mistreatment. It painted him as someone to be pitied rather than respected, reinforcing the narrative that had been building for years. But Harold couldn't control the stories they told or the perspective they offered the children. He could only remain consistent in his own actions and communications, maintaining the door for future contact when Michael and Sarah were old enough to form their own judgments. The weeks turned to months, autumn giving way to winter along the Jersey shore. Harold extended his rental through the winter, finding unexpected beauty in the deserted beaches and dramatic storms that rolled in from the Atlantic. He joined a woodworking club that met weekly at the community center, sharing techniques and projects with others who understood the satisfaction of creating with one's hands. Peterson called periodically with updates. Ethan had not appealed the dismissal of the guardianship petition, likely on the advice of his attorney. He had, however, attempted to gain access to Harold's new bank accounts, claiming he still held power of attorney. The attempt was unsuccessful as the revocation had been properly filed and distributed to all relevant financial institutions. "He seems to be running out of legal avenues," Peterson observed during one call, "which is for the best. These unsuccessful attempts are creating a documented pattern that could potentially support a harassment claim if things escalate further." Harold doubted it would come to that. Ethan was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He would eventually recognize the futility of legal maneuvers and focus on damage control in his professional and social circles. As Christmas approached, Harold faced the emotional weight of his first major holiday alone since Margaret's death. In previous years, even as the relationship with Ethan and Diana deteriorated, he had still been included in family celebrations, seated at the far end of the table perhaps. But present, this year would be different. There would be no pretense of family unity, no carefully wrapped gifts for the grandchildren, no strained conversation over turkey and stuffing. Just Harold alone in his cottage by the sea. Rather than dwelling on what was lost, Harold decided to focus on creating something meaningful from his current circumstances. He joined a community service group organizing Christmas dinners for isolated seniors, finding purpose in helping others who, like himself, were separated from family during the holidays. He also worked diligently to complete special gifts for Michael and Sarah, a detailed model sailboat for his grandson, a jewelry box with intricate inlay work for his granddaughter. These he sent through Peterson, along with cards expressing his continuing love and the hope that someday, when they were older, they might reconnect. The Christmas Day community dinner was a surprisingly joyful event, bringing together a diverse group of people who, for various reasons, found themselves alone during the holidays. Harold helped serve food, engaged in conversations with people whose stories often echoed aspects of his own, and even played a few carols on the upright piano in the corner, a skill he hadn't practiced in years. When he returned to the cottage that evening, he found an unexpected package had been delivered to the property management office. It was small, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Inside was a handmade card featuring a somewhat clumsy drawing of a chess piece and the message, "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," in childish handwriting. Michael's Harold thought, recognizing the style from birthday cards in previous years. Accompanying the card was a small, smooth stone, painted to resemble the knight chess piece Harold had carved for Michael's set. It was clearly the work of a child, the paint slightly smudged, the proportions imperfect. But to Harold, it was more valuable than any commercially produced gift could have been. How had Michael managed to send this? Had Diana helped showing an unexpected moment of empathy? Or had the boy somehow arranged it himself, perhaps with the assistance of a school friend or teacher? Harold would probably never know. But the gift itself was enough tangible evidence that he had not been forgotten, that the bonds of family persisted despite the conflict with Ethan. Harold placed the painted stone carefully on his bedside table next to Margaret's photo. Then, for the first time since leaving his home in Massachusetts, he allowed himself to weep not from anger or hurt, but from the bittersweet recognition that love could endure even across the barriers of distance, conflict, and miscommunication. The winter passed, slowly marked by storms that battered the coast and quiet days when Harold walked the empty beaches collecting shells and watching seabirds navigate the wind. He began to feel less like a visitor and more like a resident of Cape May, recognized at the coffee shop, greeted by name at the hardware store, included in the small, daily interactions that formed the fabric of community. As spring approached, Harold faced the decision he had been postponing, whether to make Cape May his permanent home or to continue searching for the right place to settle. The cottage rental had served its purpose as a temporary refuge, but it wasn't a long-term solution. After careful consideration, Harold decided to remain in Cape May, but in a more permanent setting. With the help of a local realtor, he found a small bungalow 3 blocks from the beach, modest but well-maintained, with a detached garage that could be converted into a proper workshop. The price was reasonable, especially compared to Massachusetts real estate, and would leave him with substantial savings even after the purchase and renovations. Peterson handled the legal aspects of the transaction remotely, ensuring that the property was purchased through a trust to provide an additional layer of privacy. By April, Harold had moved into his new home, unpacking the few possessions he had brought from Massachusetts and gradually acquiring what was needed to make the space functional and comfortable. The workshop conversion became his primary project, a labor that connected his past skills with his present circumstances. Harold designed the space carefully with proper lighting, ventilation, and storage for the tools he had brought and those he planned to acquire. Working with his hands had always been his most reliable source of satisfaction, a tangible counterpoint to the intangible complexities of human relationships. As he settled into his new home and community, Harold maintained his habit of writing to Michael and Sarah on their birthdays and at Christmas, sending modest gifts and maintaining the door for future contact. He never received another direct response like the painted chess piece, but Peterson occasionally relayed that the gifts had been received and apparently appreciated. Ethan's attempts at legal intervention had ceased entirely after the failed guardianship petition and power of attorney claims. Whether this represented acceptance of the new reality or simply a tactical retreat, Harold couldn't know. What mattered was that the constant pressure and manipulation had ended, allowing him to focus on building his new life rather than defending against threats to his autonomy. 1 year after his arrival in Cape May, Harold celebrated with a small gathering at his home, new friends from the woodworking club, neighbors, and Barbara from the property management company who had been so helpful during his initial transition. It wasn't a formal anniversary party, just an informal dinner to mark the passing of time and the establishment of new connections. As his guests chatted and enjoyed the meal Harold had prepared, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year. He had lost much: his longtime home, regular contact with his grandchildren, the illusion of family unity he had maintained even as it crumbled beneath the surface. But he had also gained independence, self-respect, new friendships, a community that valued him for himself rather than what he could provide. It wasn't the life he had envisioned in his younger years, when he and Margaret had planned for retirement, surrounded by family and lifetime friends. But it was a life of dignity and purpose, built on his own terms after the painful recognition that the alternatives would have required surrendering his autonomy and self-respect. Later that evening, after his guests had departed, Harold sat on his small front porch, listening to the distant sound of waves and watching stars appear in the darkening sky. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Grandpa, it's Michael. I'm using my friend's phone. Mom and Dad don't know. I got your address from the return label on my birthday present. I'm turning 14 next month and I want to know what really happened. They won't tell me the truth. Can I write to you directly?" Harold read the message several times, his heart racing with unexpected emotion. After a moment's consideration, he replied, "Michael, I'm so glad to hear from you. Yes, you can write to me directly. Here's my address. Whatever questions you have, I'll answer them honestly. I've missed you very much." As he sent the reply, Harold felt something shift within him, not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet opening, a small light appearing where there had been only shadow. Michael's reaching out represented possibility, not of reconciliation with Ethan perhaps, but of maintaining connection with the next generation, despite the breach that had occurred. It wasn't resolution or restoration of what had been lost, but it was something equally valuable, the beginning of something new built on truth, rather than obligation or manipulation. A relationship based on mutual choice rather than circumstance or expectation. Harold sat on the porch until the night air grew cool, watching the stars and listening to the rhythm of the distant waves. The path forward wasn't entirely clear, but it was his to walk one step at a time, with dignity intact and hope renewed. In the quiet darkness, Harold whispered words meant for himself alone. "I didn't just survive what happened, Margaret. I found my way forward. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth and self-respect. And maybe, just maybe, in connection that can be rebuilt on better foundations." The ocean breeze carried his words away, but their meaning remained settling into his heart, like a promise kept, a journey completed, a new chapter begun.